Is the U.S. a threat to Canada's natural resources? For decades, Canada has been recognized as one of the most resource-rich nations in the world, boasting vast reserves of oil, fresh water, timber, minerals, and natural gas. However, as global demand for these resources grows, especially with climate change, economic shifts, and geopolitical pressures, Canada faces increasing pressure from its largest trading partner and closest neighbor, the United States. While the Canada-US relationship has long been based on economic cooperation, the extraction, trade, and control of Canada's natural resources raise serious concerns about sovereignty, sustainability, and environmental protection. U.S. dependence on Canadian oil and gas, energy security versus environmental concerns. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of crude oil and natural gas to the United States. Nearly 98% of Canada's oil exports go to the U.S., making it one of the most critical energy sources for American industries and households. However, this one-sided dependency has led to long-term economic and environmental risks for Canada. How the U.S. benefits from Canadian oil. Cheap imports. The U.S. buys Canadian oil at a discount because Canada lacks sufficient pipeline infrastructure to export globally. Energy security. Canada is a stable, non-OPEC oil producer, ensuring U.S. energy independence. American-owned pipelines. The U.S. dominates Canada's pipeline infrastructure, controlling key projects like the Enbridge Line 5 pipeline. Threats to Canada, pipeline dependence, and vulnerability. The U.S. influences Canada's energy policies by blocking or supporting pipelines based on its own economic interests. For example, the Keystone XL pipeline, which would have transported oil to the U.S., was canceled under the Biden administration, while existing pipelines like Line 5 in Michigan face threats of shutdowns. Environmental costs on Canadian soil. The Alberta oil sands, one of the most pollution-heavy oil sources, are being extracted primarily to serve U.S. refineries, leaving Canada with the long-term environmental damage. Lack of market diversification. Because the U.S. is the primary buyer of Canadian oil, Canada has little negotiating power on pricing and cannot fully benefit from its own resources. What can Canada do? Invest in diversifying oil exports to Europe and Asia instead of relying on the U.S. Strengthen environmental policies to prevent unchecked oil extraction for U.S. interests. Negotiate better pricing and control over energy infrastructure. Water security. The looming crisis and U.S. interests in Canadian freshwater. With climate change leading to severe droughts in the U.S., states like California, Arizona, and Nevada are facing chronic water shortages. Canada, which holds 20% of the world's freshwater supply, is seen as a potential solution for future U.S. water needs. How the U.S. benefits from Canadian water. Hydroelectric power. Over 10% of U.S. electricity comes from Canadian hydroelectric dams, ensuring cheap power for American cities. Bottled water industry. American companies profit from bulk water exports, often at low costs. Future water security. Some U.S. states have proposed large-scale water pipelines to divert Canadian freshwater to the U.S. Threats to Canada. Water as a trade commodity. Under NAFTA-USMCA, once Canada starts exporting bulk water, it may legally be forced to continue selling it, even in the face of Canadian shortages. Over-extraction of groundwater. Many U.S. companies, such as Nestlé, extract massive amounts of water from Canadian aquifers, sometimes at shockingly low costs, as little as 2.25 per million liters in Ontario. Potential water privatization. If the U.S. increases its water imports, Canada may lose control over its own water reserves. What can Canada do? Ban bulk water exports to prevent U.S. dependence on Canadian freshwater. Strengthen water conservation policies to protect against overuse. Enforce fair pricing and extraction limits for foreign corporations. Canada's forests cover 347 million hectares, making it one of the largest timber producers in the world. The U.S. heavily depends on Canadian lumber for construction, yet it has imposed tariffs and trade disputes that harm the Canadian industry while still demanding a steady supply. How the U.S. benefits from Canadian timber. Affordable Canadian lumber. The U.S. imports nearly 75% of its softwood lumber from Canada. Control over investment. U.S. corporations own large stakes in Canadian logging companies. Trade pressure on Canada. By imposing tariffs, the U.S. controls the pricing of Canadian timber. Threats to Canada. Economic manipulation. The U.S. imposes tariffs on Canadian lumber while buying large quantities at discounted prices. deforestation risks. Increased exports lead to unsustainable logging practices and loss of wildlife habitats. Loss of local industry. U.S. companies owning Canadian mills and forests reduces Canadian control over its own resources. What can Canada do? Impose retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods. Invest in sustainable forestry policies to prevent deforestation. Diversify timber exports to reduce reliance on the U.S. market. Canada is one of the world's largest producers of nickel, lithium, uranium, and rare earth elements, REs, resources critical for electronics, electric vehicles, and military technology. As the U.S. seeks to reduce dependence on China, it is turning to Canadian mines to secure these strategic materials. How the U.S. benefits from Canadian mines. Critical mineral supply. Canada provides 40% of the U.S.'s uranium and increasing amounts of lithium and cobalt. American investment in Canadian mines. Many Canadian mines are owned by U.S. SPOL or multinational companies. Reduced dependence on China. Canada is being pressured to prioritize U.S. supply chains over global markets. Threats to Canada. Foreign control over resources. U.S. corporations own or invest in many Canadian mines, reducing Canada's direct benefit. Environmental costs. Canada is left with toxic waste and deforestation while the U.S. profits from refined minerals. Loss of global market power. The U.S. pressures Canada to sell minerals exclusively to American buyers, limiting Canada's ability to negotiate better deals globally. What can Canada do? Ensure Canadian ownership of critical mineral projects, enforce strict environmental regulations on mining operations, negotiate fair trade agreements that prioritize Canadian economic interests. Conclusion: is the U.S. a threat to Canada's resources? The U.S. is not just a trading partner, it is a resource competitor that exploits Canada's natural wealth while ensuring that Canada remains economically dependent. From energy to water, forests to minerals, the U.S. benefits from weaker Canadian regulations, discounted exports, and economic leverage over trade policies. With climate change and rising global demand, Canada must take stronger measures to protect its natural resources before it loses control over its most valuable assets. The time has come for Canada to assert its sovereignty, enforce stricter resource protections, and prioritize its long-term national interests over American economic demands. The question remains, is the U.S. an ally or a threat when it comes to Canada's natural wealth? Is this the reason U.S. wants to take over Canada? Let us know your thoughts.